Well, it's always very difficult to define. Edinburgh seems to be full of different magical properties. Some of us think of witches, wizards, wizardry generally. Hard to avoid in this town, of course. Black cats wandering across a path, or of course staring you down. Other creatures, including gargoyles and other heraldic symbols such as the world-famous unicorn, which Scotland had long ago adopted as something very close to its heart. It's very, very difficult, in short, to define what we may be talking about when magic is spoken of with Edinburgh. In 1979, the geographer George Gordon wrote that Edinburgh's landscape was created by three forces: volcanism, tectonic movement, and glaciation. To these geological forces, one could add a touch of magic. The Scots capital nowadays seems like it did indeed rise from volcanic basalt, especially viewing the city's skyline against the quiet menace of Arthur's Seat beyond. And such a spectacular scene immediately conjures up the feeling of some magical property. For a city better known for its Enlightenment tradition, a capital of finance, jurisprudence, politics, the use of magic may indeed seem a little embarrassing. What do we mean by magic? This could be witchcraft, sleight of hand, Gandalf, boy wizards, feeling of the uncanny. It is hard to avoid any of these things here, even now when wizarding wands can still be found from the South Bridge to Cockburn Street. Perhaps it's that silly, unquantifiable aspect of magic, the fact it simply can't be articulated but only experienced, that makes it so much part of life in this city. In any event, magic has been hard to avoid for much of Edinburgh's history, and quite possibly prehistory. There is the lingering connection to an old Celtic people from before the 7th century, from a time where the language spoken was closer to modern Welsh than Gaelic. With that said, it's not surprising that Arthur's Seat has been viewed as one of a number of potential King Arthur connections. The old Welsh bards of the first millennium did indeed speak of a severed contact with their northern Cumbrian countrymen and the Lothians, referred to as the Men of the North. Edinburgh's growth as a settlement, a town, a borough, a city has helped produce the conditions that lend it an air of mystery, especially with those dense patterns of tenements clustering together as you walk east of the old Netherbow. There are still remnants of the old barriers that have kept its citizens safe and a bit claustrophobic, from the King's Wall of the mid-15th century to the Telfer Wall of the early 17th. Of course, magic has its dark and light. Edinburgh's history of perceived witches and warlocks is a subject in itself, and there is a great store of fiendish characters, necromancers indeed. One might think of Francis Stewart, the 5th Earl of Bothwell in the 1590s, all the way to Major Thomas Weir in 1670. But for every apparent wizard, there are wonderful stories to debunk the fears of sorcery, such as the original Napier of Merchiston, whose apparent demonic control over birds was more down to his tendency to soak seed in alcohol before distributing it to the pigeons who disturbed him in his tower. Locals who beheld the falling of birds were convinced of some malevolent superpowers. But in spite of all these stories of magical individuals, the city continues to possess a form of immanent magic, something deep within its core, felt by those who live in it and by those who visit. Of course, the rational thinker may see a different type of power, the beauty of sunlight splashing across the enlightened buildings of the West End, or the rare sight of a snow-covered Canongate kirkyard from the Regent Terrace. Perhaps magic is merely a combination of the right weather, the right spot, and the right camera angle. But in Edinburgh, there's always something else that bubbles under the cool logic of its Presbyterian and enlightened past, and one can glimpse this element of otherworldliness by the amazing beasts that hide in the city's architecture, often in plain sight. There are unicorns aplenty around St. Giles High Kirk, and gargoyles from the castle's exterior down to the insides of old St. Paul's. And then there are the cat and owl corbels of Cockburn Street. These creature features, far from being grotesque, are visible reminders of our old use of magical charms to ward off evil. Perhaps it's not surprising that the city which gave us the dark dualistic nature of a Deacon Brodie should balance the natural and supernatural worlds. The keen intellect of a David Hume would reject any such notion as superstition, but it's pleasant to note Hume himself walking down from the Lawn Market, not far from where his imposing statue now sits, and marvelling at the sunlight piercing through the rooftops of the city's medieval St. Giles. It's a magic that's experienced best in just such fleeting moments, and Edinburgh is full of them.